Hi, welcome. I'm Andy Rotherham. I am a co-founder and partner at Bellwether Education. We're a national education nonprofit. We work across the country. We might be the only education organization that can host a debate like this because we are home to big school choice proponents and big school choice skeptics all work happily side by side at Bellwether. This is a partnership between Bellwether, the Progressive Policy Institute, and their project on reinventing America's schools, and the 74. And I encourage you, if you're not familiar with those organizations, to learn more about the great work that they do. This is a terrific conversation debate we're going to have. Someone has to decide, is a school good? What does that even mean in the education context? And then how do you sort of enforce that? And should that be the public acting through states and school districts? Should that be parents acting unilaterally, or some combination? I don't expect we're going to solve this over the next hour. I mean, if you look back, great thinkers through the ages have generally written essays about sort of what education should look like and who should control it. And that's both the ancients and contemporary thinkers. I don't expect us to solve it here in the next hour, as I said, but I think we will shed some light on some of the modern complexities and trade-offs. And that's because we have a terrific panel here, and they're going to introduce themselves in just a moment. Before they do that, a survey is going to pop up. If you could just indicate what's the group that you most identify with: parent, educator, funder, journalist, advocate, policymaker, just to help us get a sense of who is here. And I'll show the results on that in just a minute. And while we're doing that, I'm going to have the speakers, on the basic assumption that they know themselves better than I know them, I'm going to have them introduce themselves and talk very, very briefly just about the perspective that they bring to that. And I think we'll start, Maggie, why don't we start with you? We'll do you and Catherine, and then Darrell and David.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Maggie Garrett. I am the Vice President of Public Policy at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I'm also the co-chair of the National Coalition for Public Education, or NCPE. We are a coalition of more than 50 national organizations. We all come from very different backgrounds and have very different goals in our everyday work, but we all agree that public school money, or public money, should go to public schools and not to private school vouchers. And so that's pretty much where I stand.
Great, Catherine.
I am Catherine Mangu-Ward. I'm editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, which is the magazine of free minds and free markets. Before I was editor-in-chief, education was one of my beats, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the role that private accountability and choice can play in improving schools. Also, as my mug indicates, I am the best mom.
Terrific. And if you don't read Reason, I encourage you to. They actually cover education debates quite a bit. And if it's not on your sort of regular reading list, it should be. Darrell.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank Bellwether, the 74, and PPI for having me. I'm Darrell Bradford. I'm the Executive Vice President at 50CAN, which is a network of local, state-based advocacy campaigns working to improve education policy across the country. I used to run our New York campaign, and now I work on our national team. I'm a hardcore school choicer, but I think I'm kind of like a centrist almost in this distribution. And I don't have a mug, but I do have a thermos that virtue signals for me.
David?
I'm David Osborne. I'm with the Progressive Policy Institute, and I have spent most of my career researching and writing about how to drag our public institutions, including public schools, into the 21st century and improve their performance. So it's great to be here, Andy. Thanks for moderating this and partnering on it.
Terrific. Okay, can we quickly show those survey results so people can get a sense on who's here? So we got a lot of advocates, some policymakers, educators, and parents, although that may just not be the one. I suspect Catherine's not the only one with a mug. There may be more parents here. I know I'm one. All right, terrific. We're going to do one more survey. I'm not going to show the results right now, but we're going to do a baseline sort of on the question we're discussing. And then at the end, we'll do a post survey and see whichever panelists changed your minds the most. We'll send them some Omaha steaks or something. So go ahead and take a look right here. Who do you think, as an audience member, of these three choices should hold schools accountable for performance? And while you're answering that, let's go ahead and get the conversation started. Catherine, I'm going to start with you because you're sort of on the leading edge of the direction policy is moving, which it's hard to miss over the last few years. And we'll talk more about this. There's just state after state in different ways is expanding choice options, including private school choice and scholarships and so forth. So that's the leading edge in terms of the direction things are going. So why should that be the leading edge? Make the case. Why is that the best way to figure out this really hard question of is a school good and who should decide?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Andy, you're right that this is a long-standing trend, that we are really moving in the direction of trying to give more agency to families and parents. That makes a lot of sense to me because those are the people who have the most at stake in any individual kid's education, but also in their local communities. And so I think there is this broader trend, but I would say, the elephant in the room here, and something that we're certainly going to talk about, is what has happened in the last year, especially with public schools. And I think that it is really, really hard, and I will be interested to hear what my co-panelists have to say. I think it's really, really hard to defend the idea that public accountability is working well for kids in this last year. This has been a brutal year for everyone. And so I don't want to say that, this should have been easy. How come they couldn't solve this right away? It was a tough year. At the same time, my kids and so many other people's kids were completely out of school for an entire year. And I think that is, in many cases, because of the way that our public accountability mechanisms are built and the ways in which they are broken. So I want to talk about how we capitalize on a lot of parents being forced to take ownership of their kids' education this year. Maybe they weren't quite ready to do that. Maybe they didn't quite think this was a role they wanted to take on, but it happened. And now we have some momentum there for parents to really, look for ways to continue shaping their kids' education in the ways that are important to them and having choices when things get back to normal.
Terrific. Darrell, what would you add to that? You said as you introduced yourself, you're on the pro school choice side, both this experience of the last year. And I mean, it has been, my kids are on an asynchronous day today and they've been cooking me crepes all morning. So I'm not it's a fattening experience. I'm not sure it's a learning experience. So it has been a hard year. So Darrell, talk about sort of from the perspective of the work you do and what you're seeing, why do you think this is the direction that we should continue to drive?
Yeah, so I will try to add something that isn't just comic relief to that strong opener. So I do think there are a couple of things, and I do want to talk about the last year because I think the last year is really important. So one of these questions is just choice, right? Choosing schools or the devices that let you do that. It's unique in that it is both a policy and a value, right? And so you can emphasize how you believe people should move and interact through with the world and how they should interact with our institutions. And if that is more important to you, the policy you support looks different, right? You can emphasize choice as a device of accountability, right? Either through exit or through competition. And if you do that, then the kind of policy you support also looks different. So I just want to highlight that because I think it's, I've frequently had a foot in both camps on this. I'm an assessment guy, have been an assessment guy. I care about data and transparency. I think those things matter. And certainly when we spend money, as a society, results matter, right? And you need to find some way to figure that out. That said, I feel pre Arnie Duncan's unfortunate press conference where he brought all the suburban soccer moms off of the bench on Common Core, right? Where he was like, these people don't want to know that Johnny isn't doing as well as he's doing. And then it was maybe there's too much testing, right? Sort of in the run up to that, maybe starting to crest with that. And then certainly on through ESSA, what I think we've seen, on the one hand, from some parents who were frustrated about our accountability regimes, right? Which, testing, annual results, and all of that stuff, right? And less altruistic actors who were looking to get out from under accountability at all, right? Is an unfortunate confluence of interests that means if you care about accountability, it's not going to look how it looked before, right? Just sort of period. We're just in a very different place in how we define what good is, how we measure it, and how we report it out to the world. And I do think that here's where I'll be squarely in the camp with Catherine, as I'm sure I will be again later. Like for something as complicated as your kid's education, right? A parent's moment-to-moment assessment and self-interest are like the like magic quantity, right? Because it can change at any time, and it is focused on the end goal in a way that basically no institutional interest can be. And so however we want to measure things, right? However we want to hold things accountable, I think to the extent that you diminish parent agency, the rubric is worse off. And to the extent that you increase it, it is more subtle and more likely to stay in place.
Okay, so that's a terrific way to segue right to you, Maggie. This idea of sort of you increase parental agency. There's all these things people want from schools. It's impossible to measure them all or to account for them all. And so like you can't do that in a planful way. You just have to let it happen. So give parents agency. It all sounds very intuitive. What's wrong? What's wrong with that? What are the problems that we're not seeing?
Right. So in a lot of the voucher programs, right, the idea is that parents will make the choice, and that the public shouldn't really have anything to say about that because the parents know best. But I think we need to start with the idea here that this is public dollars, right? And so anytime you have public dollars, you have to be accountable to the public. There has to be oversight, monitoring, minimum teacher requirements. Otherwise, we don't know what we're funding. We don't know if it's working. We don't know if we're throwing away our money. And whether, what those measurements of accountability should be, maybe that's up to, to a discussion, but whether or not there needs to be accountability to the public, that should not be a question. And I want to also remind ourselves that public education isn't just a private consumer good, right? Like it's a public good. It benefits all of us. And that is why all of us, whether you have school age kids, whether you have no kids, we all pay into the system. And it's to make sure that kids have fulfilling jobs and live happy lives, but it's also, it's critical to a functioning democracy, right? So I think we can't abdicate our responsibility for educating our nation's children to private entities often looking to make a profit and that don't have the same obligations to the public good. And I'm not going to say public schools are perfect. They're certainly not. They have many big issues. They've got systematic racism issues. There's inequalities. But vouchers don't fix the public schools, right? They just ignore the problems and they leave the public schools there with less money to address them. So they're diverting desperately needed resources away from the public school system that serve the vast majority of students. 9 out of 10 kids go to the public schools. And instead they educated a few select students at private schools. And I think that the government would be better, they would better serve our children by using taxpayer dollars to strengthen our public schools. And I just want to say one more thing to start about the idea, right, that parents should be making the choice. Vouchers don't give parents this high quality choice that many of us are claiming that they do, right? Vouchers really give private schools a choice because private schools are the ones who can pick and choose who goes there. They can admit whoever they want. They can use whatever admission standards they want. They can turn away kids because of their wrong religion, because they're LGBTQ, because their parents don't make money above the amount of the voucher, because they have a disability, because they can't meet a test. And so this isn't really a system, right, where parents can just, pick, I want to go to that school and I get to go to that school. So, it's not quite this ideal system that we're talking about.
All right, so David, and we'll come back to that because like across the public system, there's lots of different ways to.
I would like to come back to that. Yeah, not
okay.
Now,
come back. First, I want to just, David has this like compromise, charter schools emerged as a compromise view on this. And the early evidence on charters, the biggest predictor of a state, if it was going to pass a charter law, was if there was a big push for vouchers there. And so not surprisingly, some of the early states were like Colorado, California, a place where there was big voucher referendums happening simultaneously. And it was this idea that, okay, we're going to combine public money and public accountability. And, Milton Friedman talked about like a neighborhood effect, that he felt schools should be publicly funded, even if parents should have unfettered choice, because there are powerful externalities to schools. So we were going to marry that idea with giving parents choice and lowering barriers to entry for who could open and operate a school. they grew rapidly, David, as you well know. The last few years, growth has really flattened out. So talk about charters both as a sort of middle way, third way through this debate, and why is the energy, it seems increasingly the energy in this debate's more on the right and the left than around charter schools.
So 30 years ago, when the first charter school bill was passing the Minnesota legislature, I was finishing the book Reinventing Government. And at the time, I thought that, well, with charters or with vouchers, parents would desert the lousy schools, they'd flock to the good schools, and that's the only accountability mechanism you needed. So I was on Catherine's side of this. Let's have as much of a market as we can, although for other reasons, I lean toward a public market for equity reasons, and we can come back to that. But we then proceeded to experiment with that. We have different charter systems around the country, and in some of them, the authorizers who say you get a charter and we'll renew your charter do a good job. And they hold those schools accountable for their performance, and if they're terrible, they close them. But in other places, the authorizers don't do their job, and they don't close failing schools. And what we've discovered in those places is that the parents don't close them either. That there are some parents, whether it's because of low education levels, or they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they don't speak English, who, as long as the school is safe and warm and nurturing, they're happy. And those schools survive year after year after year. And those kids end up graduating or dropping out, whichever, without the tools for anything but a low skill, low paid job in this economy. We also, as vouchers emerged, in places like Louisiana, you had some lousy private schools started up to get the voucher money. And again, the parents didn't usually close them by deserting them. So I think we've learned through experience the hard way that the public sector has to hold schools that get public money accountable for their performance. I've been an advocate of choice, maximizing choice for 30 years, ever since Reinventing Government. Totally believe in that. And I support vouchers for poor kids. Vouchers for everybody is another issue, and I'm happy to come back to that. That's where the equity issue comes in. But I think we've learned the hard way that we can't just rely on parents. So my argument is, let's use both. Let's give parents lots of choices, and when they move their child, let's move the money with it so that the school feels the consequences and is accountable to the parents. But because that's not enough, let's have districts or authorizers also measure the school performance and hold them accountable. And the problem with that is we've done such a bad job of it. I mean, No Child Left Behind was a really stupid law. And the way it defined school quality and measured school quality was fundamentally flawed and relied way too heavily on test scores, and not just academic growth, but actual status, which meant any school with middle-class kids in it looked good and any school with poor kids in it looked bad. Anyway, that discredited, in many minds, the whole idea of measuring school performance. And I think we have to change how we measure, and
can
do it
you
in a more
measure,
sophisticated way.
David, can you measure? The problem with No Child Left Behind, the resistance was in the suburbs. It was schools with achievement gaps in the suburbs. They didn't want to talk about that, which raises a whole set of equity issues and what we should do for those parents. But can you, is there a way to actually measure the range of things that people want out of schools? Is that even doable?
Sure, yeah, I believe it is. And in my last book, Reinventing American Schools, I have a chapter on this, and I lay out, here's what we ought to measure for high schools, here's what we ought to measure for K through 8 schools. I think test scores should be about half the picture. I think you should survey parents to measure how satisfied they are with the school and how engaged their students are. I think you should look at graduation rates and outcomes, that is college going, employment, et cetera, for graduates of high schools. And I think that we should do what the British do, which is every few years send a team of seasoned educators into each school using the same rubric to rate its quality. Have them spend 3 days in the school, do a lot of interviews and look at all the data and end up giving the school ratings on different aspects of quality. So I think, you know, I've been studying and writing about performance measurement for 30 years, and it's hard, but you can always get a little better. And boy, we're a long way from where we need to be.
Darrell, I know you want to come in, but I want to hear from Catherine. Catherine, on this idea, like, you know, from the Liberty corner, this idea, can you measure these things? Is this even doable? Or like, we're going to design a system that can measure the 100 things, but there's going to be a bunch of parents. The 101st is going to be the thing that like matters to them, because it's hard to plan for. It's hard to plan for humans. We're unpredictable.
Yeah, I mean, we already had Milton Friedman already entered the chat, but I'm going to bring in a little Friedrich Hayek just to fully inhabit my stereotype and say that, you know, this is a classic knowledge problem. This is a classic case where, like, I have tremendous faith that David has put a huge amount of good faith, thoughtful effort into figuring out exactly the best way from his perspective and with society's needs in mind to measure what a good school looks like. But as he just said, it's incredibly difficult. Even if we had all the data and we had broad social consensus, it would still be really hard to crunch these numbers and maximize education for most kids or for all kids and for all families. But we have this other mechanism that helps people get what they want without having to like dump everything into a central repository and then pull it back out again. And that mechanism is markets. And, you know, the idea that we can simply, you know, remove like the sedimentary layers of attempts to improve these public systems and instead make education, particularly K-12 education, look more like markets that function very well in many sectors of society and many areas of parental decision making already, right? Like, we're saying, you know what, parents don't always do a great job of maximizing for their kids, and that's true, but we let parents make decisions in all other kinds of ways. We let parents make kid decisions about kids' nutrition, say, or housing. And, you know, I'm gonna, you know, risk my libertarian bona fides a little bit here and say, like, of course, there are places for regulation, for subsidy, for support, especially for people who are the least well off. But I think, especially for families that in this last year ended up spending their own time and resources to provide education for their children against the backdrop of a total failure of public accountability. You know, 3 million kids disappeared from schools essentially in the last year, disproportionately Black and brown kids, disproportionately unhoused kids. I think that we have genuinely seen that even millions, thousands, maybe millions of people working really hard to create good standards, gather good data, and then try to act on them are still, frankly, failing. And I think that a more dynamic system that uses the power of individual decision making to improve outcomes, you know, we can at least move closer to that. And I think money follows the kid, backpack funding, whatever you want to call it. I think that's a step in the right direction. But I also think, you know, in the example of these, you know, these the various charter systems where bad charters are sticking around, you know, that's in many cases, or where parents are sticking around in bad charters, in many cases, that's because the other alternatives are still not good enough. And because the options are still too constrained. I think the more you maximize choice, the more you see the opportunity for bad providers to fail. And I think that's the piece that's always undervalued in this debate is like, bad schools should fail, bad public schools should fail and close, bad charters should fail and close. Bad private schools mostly already do fail and close. And so to my mind, that's where we need to be headed for the other providers as well.
All right, Darrell, you pitched yourself as the centrist. So now's your moment. Is there a way through that? And there is this issue. Catherine makes a compelling point that one of the dynamics we see with schools not closing is because choices are so constrained. But there is an old saying in education, you know, closing a school is like moving a graveyard. You don't get a lot of help from the inside. Like, so is there a way through this?
So just I think three things, and then I'll try to answer your question. The first one is that there's like a little bit of a, it's not a tension, but I feel it here, and it's definitional, right? There's choice as an element of accountability, and then there's choice as accountability, right? And those are two different things, right? And I've normally been a person who is choice and, right? Because like if it's public money or not public money or whatever, right? Like you want people to have as much information as possible about the performance of a thing, right? On some rubric that we can, measure easily and systematically, so they can make a choice, right? And so in that respect, I would say I'm like in both of these things. I think the data is always massaged by the ability of a person to act on it. And right now, what we have is like lots of data and tons of people who can't act on it at all, right? Because they can't afford a new mortgage or they can't do anything about it. And that to me is an unaccountable system. That's the system that reports out. It's an unaccountable system, right? That was the first thing. The second thing, though, also to this Hayek speech, which I actually know this speech because we teach to our fellows, is the challenge of like the easiest thing to measure, whether or not that's the most important thing to measure, right? And so it is relatively easy to like, at least outside of a political context, to measure math and language arts scores, right? I think they're pretty important to me. I think they're pretty important to most people. But lots of people value other things aside from those things. And to David's kind of point, like safety, for instance, right? So you could call that school climate, but a lot of people pick bad schools that are safe because they value safety, right? Which is completely rational, right? In a framework that values other things. So that was kind of the second thing I wanted to say. The third thing that I think is important, because it's like we're partly talking about like the role private schools play or private schools as an option play, but then we're also talking about, well, how much freedom should parents have to pick their schools, like period, and in an environment where parents have more power to do that, are schools more accountable, right? And I would submit to the august assemblage on this webinar, right? that basically we already have that system. We just have it for rich people, right? Because if you're rich, you signal accountability through the housing market all the time, right? You don't like what you have, you get up, you buy a different house. You go something like, you might buy the nice house and still send your kid to private school, right? There are all kinds of ways that if you are not weighed down by, here comes the racist legacy of housing discrimination and school zones that mirror that, right? There are all kinds of ways you send accountability signals through the system that have nothing to do with test scores, right? And they have all to do with you picking where you want to live so you can go to school. I think it's important to acknowledge that like that's sort of the regular system as we have it, and that there are lots of other people, kind of my people, basically, who live outside of that paradigm and who don't have the ability to navigate the housing market or navigate the influence market in a way that sends accountability signals outside of test scores or whatever, and we don't participate in the upper strata of that exchange. So I just want to lay that out.
Can I pop in real quick? Because
Yeah,
I think like I am like a comically on point personal anecdote here. And so I'm just going to like very briefly summarize. My kids are currently in our neighborhood zoned public school. Over the last year, we managed to put together a pod and hire like a local after school educator to be our he calls himself our governess, which really adds a whole extra layer of class and gender dynamics to the thing. We had a pod. We were able to hire this person to run education for our kids, who were also using online learning tools. Next year, my kids are going to go to private school, in part because I don't want to tolerate the risk, and also because of public accountability next year. And it's a micro school that's a startup, that's an independent school, and also we can move. Like I have school choice. Oh, and we could have gone into a charter lottery this year and had a good chance of some really robust options because I live in Washington, D.C. Like I have all of the school. I personally am living the school choice lifestyle, and it's great and still inadequate. I still feel like my choices are overly constrained. And so I just want to highlight, like, people who are having this conversation, most of those people, many of those people have essentially my experience. And I think it can be easy to really underestimate the total lack of choice that like giant swaths of the country are facing.
Yeah, Maggie, I mean, you mentioned, Maggie, in your earlier, you mentioned problems with systemic racism, how they manifest themselves in schools. You have this problem in the housing market. And I think everybody on the panel agrees on the you know, terribly problematic history there. So there's sort of two dynamics here. One is how, on one hand, we're going to be, if we're concerned about this, how do we not figure out ways to sort of sever that sort of Gordian knot between where you live and where you send your kids to school? And then sort of second, how do we not deal with like, it's hard to miss the big, and I want to talk more about the politics in a minute, but like the biggest opposition now to giving parents choices is more coming from sort of the elite white progressive left. And so how do we sort of square those circles, both of those in a democratic society?
So again, I don't think that vouchers are going to solve this problem, right? So if you look at studies of voucher programs, you know, you look at the studies in Louisiana, you look at other studies, they don't show that they are leading to desegregation. They show that they're adding to more segregation, right? I think we also can't have this conversation without talking about the roots of vouchers, right? So yes, we have lots of systematic racism in our country, in our schools. Let's remember where the voucher system came from. It came from when they were trying to desegregate schools, right? And they decided that they wanted to give vouchers to the white kids to go to private schools so that they could get out of the schools that served everyone else. And so that is the roots of vouchers as well, right? So like we need to talk about that truth as well here. We keep talking about the idea that parents are going to be informed with all of this information and they're going to be able to pick the best schools. But really, voucher schools are giving marketing to these parents, right? We are setting up a system with vouchers that benefit the private schools that don't benefit the parents. They are setting up a maze for these parents to look through where they're not getting all of the information and they're not getting the information that allows them to make the informed choices. And it's, you know, if you look at, there's GAO studies from 2013 that talk about disability vouchers, right? And they talk about how they don't give parents the information to even know that, here's one, 83% of students enrolled in a disability voucher program didn't know that they were the information about their IDEA rights choices, right? So here we are saying like, oh, it's just about parents making these choices and everything will be great and we'll get out of the system that we have. We're not talking about fixing the system that we have. Most of the kids go to these schools and we're not going to change the system. What you're trying to do here, right? Now, I know people are talking about two-tiered systems, but what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create, I'm sorry, I have a dog and if anyone would like to adopt this dog,
It's all good.
her name is Maple, Lab Rescue. In
Everybody
the chat,
here
you
is pro foster dog. It's fine.
I would like to hear the dog's views on school choice.
Yeah, exactly. She got very excited earlier. So I put her outside, it started to rain. I so apologize for this. But we also can't have a multi-tiered system, right? We need to pick a system and we need to do it correctly and we need to improve it. And we need to go to the public school system. We need to talk about the inequalities there and we need to fix the inequalities there.
Yeah,
even a purely public system though, right, is a tiered system. I mean, there are so many schools that, due to a decade at least of efforts of trying to quantify this, we know are failing the students that they are supposed to be serving and have been doing so for years. And because of the way we do public accountability, we have no way to shutter those schools. We have no way to turn those schools around.
Unless they're charter schools.
Unless they're charter schools, which is, you know, on my sort of trajectory of choices would be better. But, you know, I also went to a large public school in Alexandria, Virginia, T.C. Williams High School, recently renamed.
Not T.C. Williams anymore.
Not anymore. But in the of Remember the Titans fame, for those of you who have seen it, and it was a classic example of a school where No Child Left Behind, the high performers were covering the total failure to serve the lower performers. So even within a single school, we do have these like rigid, tracked, tiered situations that it's hard for me to say.
And also problems with information, right? Like something I find, like, I mean, first of all, in general, you can still find more information about like buying an appliance than you can find about a school. But then within schools, like if you're privileged and you have power, there's all these ways information flows and you figure out what's going on and what's up that not everybody, even in the same school, has sort of, in sort of a small d democratic way access to.
Yeah, let me give you an example of what the real world is like for low-income parents. One of my daughters did Teach for America, and she taught for 3 years at a charter school in New Orleans. During the period when it was flipping to all charter, it wasn't all charter yet, but most of the schools were charters, and it was the fastest improving district in the country. But her school was in a very poor neighborhood, 100% African-American, and the parents didn't have to choose that school. The facility was awful. None of you would have you would have seen that building, the set of buildings, looked at it and walked away without even talking to anyone. But parents and grandparents, often the parents weren't around and it was the grandparents, were sending their kids to that school. Why? I mean, New Orleans had a full choice system. It had many improving schools because it was geographically closer, and they'd grown up in a system where you just were sent to the school that was closest. They didn't know any different. And maybe they dropped out in 7th or 8th grade, who knows? But that school kept going and would still be open today if the authorizer, that is the elected school board, had not closed it. And that's the real world. Now, the other thing I wanted to address was Andy's question, can we really measure school quality? Well, look, it's subjective and imprecise, there's no question, but really all we're trying to do is figure out which schools are really bad and should be replaced, and which schools are really good and should be replicated. We don't have to be super precise. Finally, I'll say all of this, we still want maximum parental choice, and it's a great accountability mechanism. It's been proven through experience that it's not enough. Even private schools, there are some bad private schools that don't close. If there's voucher money, they stay alive. We've tried it and it's not enough.
So if I can hop onto that, so we wrote a paper about this called Measure Everything, which just has like three ideas in it, right? That I think sort of live in this, like give the annual assessment, right? Because we care about that, and I think it's just to Catherine's point, and Maggie, I haven't met your dog, I love your dog, but I'm gonna stick it to you on this. The fact that almost every public school district or SEA in America is trying to get out from under giving the annual assessment this year is the most anti-accountability thing in the universe. Like this is a problem, right? Like, and there are some people who would make the case that like, look, COVID, whatever, like fine, I take COVID seriously, I had it, like, so I'm on it, right? However, for me to accept that, I would have to believe that people actually like we're doing that in good faith, and there are a lot of people that I don't think are doing that in good faith. So right now we have a system that's sort of like it's kind of been closed for a year, and it's got $190 billion and less data, right? And that's a bad mix for accountability. So I just want to like throw that out there. We got to fight over that in the future, but whatever, right? The second thing. Go ahead, Catherine.
No.
Oh, okay. The second thing I would just say is that it's like. So that was the first thing, give the annual assessment. The second one was just like acknowledge that like over the last year, people have found lots of different ways to find out how their kids are doing, right? Like, and how much of the early data on learning loss came from a roll up of Zern, right? Like that kind of thing. And so I think it's really important just to acknowledge that like, we're kind of in a different paradigm where we can have different help to figure out whether or not things are working, right, in a multi-dimensional way from like apps and platforms, right, that live outside of the traditional like SEA, LEA context, right? Because like when you give an annual assessment, that information is really important for the geeks on this webinar, right? and for state elected officials who are trying to maximize resources or intervene where things are going poorly. I think to David's point about like authorizers, like a parent may see the value in those things, but it's a different value for them than it is for people who are like trying to organize sort of for proficiency. That's the second thing. And then the third one was that we would just like, study what we measure, right? That like, there's no reason that if we're not gonna try to deploy new ways to figure out what's good, we shouldn't be intentional about watching it try to be good, so we learn something from it. Those are kind of the three things I put that out. I only throw those signposts, right, on the highway toward whatever out there, because it's clear that politically at this point, the math science annual assessment paradigm we had, we're not going to be allowed to keep it. Right. So, and we saw an erosion of support among Democrats and among, accountability Republicans coming out of the Obama administration. Like ESSA was like, wildly watered down. Even No Child Left Behind's imperfections aside, it at least set a bar up there. Right. That was an important one about like all kids making progress. Right. And we're just in like a different place now. And so to me, like this question of like, what's good, what's really good, is one we should try to figure out how to answer instead of answering today. I just think, and that's, okay.
I want to stay on that, Darrell. Two more questions. I want to make sure we get some time for this, some great audience questions. So one is what you're saying, like the accountability regime is under enormous pressure right now, sort of any kind of measurement. And so you've got to do something. You have to have accountability through parental choice. You have to have accountability through various measures or some combination, but the measures are, as you're saying, are under a lot of pressure. Like if I had to bet right now, the two political positions that seem most ascendant are Catherine's and Maggie's. So the Democratic Party is increasingly embracing Maggie's position. Independents and Republicans have been there for a while, are embracing, and independents are embracing Catherine's position. And a little bit, people, you see this in polling, people are particularly angsty and about choice and more open to choice right now. We've been polling parents and they're much more open to it after this experience. So talk a little bit about that. Like the compromise alternatives, the blends and all that, like are politically out of favor. And it's more the two positions on the polls that both seem more ascendant.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way that you phrase that question is so on point, because obviously, school policy, education policy has always been politicized, but I think it's fair to say many policy topics are more polarized now and more partisan now than they have ever been, and education is one of those topics. And so I think that we do really risk just dumping education into these pre-existing partisan buckets. And it's just like, if you have on a red hat, you like these policies, and if you have on a blue hat, you like these policies. And I think that really doesn't reflect the subtleties of the underlying views about what needs to happen with schooling in this country. I mean, among other things, Black parents vote overwhelmingly Democratic, but have relatively high support for school choice in a variety of forms. And I think that is the thing that our politics right now are not well constructed to handle. And when I think about people who are arguing for public accountability and for consolidating within a public system and increasingly aggregating power up to the federal level, these same people just witnessed 4 years of Betsy DeVos. I didn't hate Betsy DeVos, but they did. Like, they really hated her. Like, they thought she was possibly literally Satan. And so I'm struggling with, like, what does, all or nothing, one size fits all public accountability look like when we also have winner takes all hyperpolarized politics? And I think that what that means, among other things, is that kids get bounced around, that if we are reversing and then reinstating partisan decision-making about education, whether at the federal or state level, it's going to be bad for kids, just like the rest of our politics. Immigration policy is a great example, is currently getting bounced around.
So that's perfect for the other question I had for all of you. Like, it's hard to miss, like, this culture war has broken out about how schools should or should not teach about race and racism, critical theory. And like, if you're somebody like me who follows the news professionally for your job, like the clips have just gotten like incredibly depressing just over the last like couple of weeks. It's just like there's a culture war. It's hard to miss. And one thing that some people seem to be able to agree on, I was struck, is watching a debate between some different folks across various political and demographic lines of difference. And they all said, yeah, let's just have a system of school choice, because I don't want you teaching my kids. You don't want to teach my kids. You don't want me to want you to teach my kids. Like, and let's just have school choice, because we can all go off to our own corners and do what we want and not fight over this. Is that like a way through this, or is that a complete abdication of our responsibility if we're going to try to live in society together?
Can I start? I actually want to, do you mind if I add one comment to the last comment that we're talking about? Actually, let me start here. The majority of kids are going to go to public schools, and there's going to be fights about curriculum no matter what, right? Again, 9 out of 10 kids go there. If you have a voucher program, it's not going to be suddenly no kids in the public school system, right? So we're still going to be fighting about it. But in the end, you're going to exacerbate it, exactly what you said. You're not eliminating the problem. We're all going to go to separate schools. We're all going to go to our separate corners. We're all going to learn our own versions of the facts. We're not going to interact with anyone who's different from ourselves. We're not going to have anyone who challenges us. We're not going to appreciate and understand differences in other people. We're not going to learn compassion. We're just going to all go to our corners. And maybe because people are laughing at me shows that maybe people haven't learned the compassion. But at a time when our nation is really, really divided, I just think it's a terrible idea that we have all private school systems, right? Where like the Lutherans go to school over here, and the Catholics go to school over here, and the Jewish kids go to school over there. I just think that it's going to exacerbate it. And also, again, this is public funds, right? So we have to have at least a basic understanding and agreement on what we teach, right? We can't have a system where we're teaching fake science, right? Because who's going to come up with the next COVID vaccine if we are allowing schools to teach bad science and bad information? And so there has to be at least a discussion of that.
Right. We can let Randy Weingarten teach epidemiology. Look, the one thing I just want to say is like, I haven't figured out how to talk about this in the world, right? But I'm like a poor Black Catholic kid who went to school with some Episcopalians and an Ivy League college that's mostly Jewish. And I think I'm pretty tolerant, right? And so I tend to believe that the human, like the better nature of who we are as individuals and the highest aspirations of who we want to be as a country, given where we have been, are only lived out in a diverse system of schooling, right? The less diverse that system of schooling, the more likely we are to get exactly the world I think Maggie does not want, right? And when you can look at a state like Nebraska, for instance, right? I love to pick on Nebraska because Nebraska has no charter schools, right? It has a lot of public schools, a couple of private schools, right? And the public schools are all segregated, right? So we've built this system already that is incredibly good at segregating us by race, by income, by proxy, by wealth, and by education, right? We are incredibly divided right now because of the public education system we have right now, not in spite of it, right? So, and I think we should take that on. I agree that the divisions are intolerable, right? But I don't think that 8% of the American population going to private school is the thing that is driving that division, right? And maybe that's just like a different, and I know this is supposed to be like an accountability thing, but overall we're talking about like the role of picking schools in society, right? But this is actually a really important thing, because oftentimes we talk about the system we wish we had, and that conversation is imbued with the values we wish that system had. And in reality, that system has neither of those values, nor does it operate that way. And I think that's really important to consider.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And I think we need choice as a way to integrate the system. It's the best way to integrate public schools. So the more we can use choice and let people choose different kinds of schools, still with standards about, not schools where you teach fake science. We do need the state to establish standards, but the more we can do that, the more we'll have integration of all kinds. But the danger that we have to avoid is creating a market system which produces really unequal outcomes. You all know that in any pure market, the outcomes are really unequal. Housing, automobiles, whatever we buy, the more money you have, the nicer thing you get. We don't want that in education. Equal opportunity is incredibly important for the future of this country. Every child needs an opportunity. And if we continue to separate into the rich and the poor and become more unequal, our society is really in trouble. So if we go to a pure voucher system, politically, I'm convinced it's impossible to say to Americans, you get a voucher, but you can't add a dime to it. So we're going to end up with a voucher system where all of us who love our children are going to add as much as we can to the value of the voucher, send our kids to the best school we can, and boom, the system will stratify even more than it is today by income. So I think we need a market system, but with equality, with every child getting equal opportunity. And that the closest thing to that is a public charter system. So that's why I'm an advocate of that approach. Why that New Orleans is the fastest improving city and DC's second. It's because of public charter schools.
I do think there's another way to think about how to get to change, though, and that is, okay, we have some examples of big public monopolies or big public bureaucracies where they were bad enough for long enough that somebody figured out how to just innovate around them. And I'm thinking here of like, you can choose a bunch of examples, but like the post office, right? Like libertarians used to love to talk about like, we're going to privatize the post office, we're going to reform it, we're going to improve it, we're going to localize it, we're going to federalize it, we're going to change. And instead it was just like, no, let's just invent fax machines and FedEx and then email and then texting. And now it doesn't matter how bad the post office is for the most part, though it's still around and still making trouble. I think you could say this about the space program, right? Like NASA was like, oh no, we forgot how to make rockets. And Jeff Bezos was like, I got you. And Elon Musk was like, I got you. Like it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. This is not like a policy proposal, but this is a description of one kind of dynamic that sometimes obtains. And I would argue that at this point, the public system has failed so many people for so long that I will not be surprised if the combination of ed tech, online learning, micro schools, and a bunch of other innovations out there combined with this year where people were forced to look into those things before they were quite ready, I think it could really be a turning point where like schools keep being big and bad, but that the private sector gets bigger and better around it. And the bonus there is that you don't wind up with this dynamic that David is describing where people are just bidding up the good quality options. Hopefully you end up with a dynamic where good quality options get cheaper and more widely available.
And
I
Catherine,
think we do see that in lots of other sectors too. So
yeah, I mean, that's so, and that, like what you just said, like really dovetails earlier with what you're saying about the politics. Do you see those some way through for some sort of like universal service mandate? Because we know, a lot of these innovations, they, if you live in certain places, you're going to get more access to them. That's a fact of life. We have schools in all kinds of communities because we have Americans in all kinds of communities. Is there a compromise there that could bring people together? Do you see where you can have some sort of, various kinds of basically universal service mandates like we do on sort of other public utility oriented things?
I mean, I am just always looking for ways to get a big bad public monopoly to behave more like a market. And I'm willing to make compromises along the way, right? So that's why I remain interested in charters. That's why I remain interested in vouchers, even though I would prefer an all private system and think that would be better for parents. I think that, I would like us to help as many kids as possible get access to as diverse and interesting an array of educational options as possible. And I want to be hesitant about hemming that in regulatorily in an effort to help. But I think that there's this orchard is just like laden with low hanging fruit. And so I'm just looking for ways to like help a couple of kids grab those apples.
So Maggie, I want to hear from you because like the way we talk about this, often you hear people talk about like there's a church-state divide, but in fact, like lots of public money flows into parochial schools now for tuition, but also through various kinds of categorical programs. I mean, there's a fair amount of entanglement there and not terrific outcomes. I think everybody would agree from the school system. So like per Catherine's point, the direction she wants to move, she's willing to compromise. Do you think that sort of with some of the energy that's emerging around these other sectors, is there a way to sort of essentially rationalize what's happening now? Or do you think people who are in your camp are going to be more, more of, I guess, more in a no or hell no kind of position on moving it all? How do you handicap those politics?
So there's two things I want to say. One, vouchers were supposed to be the innovation, right? That was what's supposed to improve things. But when you look at the studies of the 3 oldest voucher programs in the country, Cleveland, Milwaukee, DC, it shows that they've led to no statistically significant improvements in reading or math. The same is true for Alabama. The same is true for the Florida tuition tax credit. And so this innovation that we're claiming is showing so much success is actually not showing the success that we're claiming. And so that's a real problem. And that I think we need to actually admit the fact that they're not changing the system as we're claiming they are. And so why are we spending all of this money on this program that's supposed to innovate everything, but is not? As far as camps, right, like whether or not people are going to compromise, I think the answer is the reason people are compromising less is because when you start these small programs, right, they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a program for low income kids, and then you sort of raise that, and then you go on. You look at Florida, for instance, like how many vouchers do they have? Now they have statewide vouchers. And so it's always an excuse to start it, and then you make it bigger, and then you make it bigger, and then you make it bigger. And it doesn't matter if it's working or not, right? Because you look at the DC voucher program that was a pilot program for 5 years. It has had 6 different Department of Education studies under different presidents, Republicans and Democrats, and it shows that it's not improving education. It shows that it's actually not improving parental satisfaction, and yet we keep extending it. And instead of having more accountability, instead of looking at the GAO reports that say that there are accountability problems, what did they do? They said, oh, we're showing no improvement in reading or math. We'll get rid of the study that we're using and make it less rigorous, right? And so, we keep talking about the accountability standards, but when you look at what the voucher programs are doing, they're not saying we'll have some accountability standards. They're getting rid of the accountability standards. Even in Florida, the bill they just passed, the big, massive one, they didn't add accountability even after they've shown all of these problems with the system. They actually made the accountability measures worse. And so I think that's why people aren't going to compromise, because it ends up not being that compromise, right? Like they come back and they keep making it bigger.
I would just add two quick things. I know we're up. One is that all programs that have political context have to work to get bigger, because the bigger program has better politics, right? And one of the reasons why public schools are so powerful politically is because they are everywhere without regard to quality, right? So the size of the program is huge. And charter schools or private schools or voucher schools or whatever you want to call it are all significantly smaller. So I think one of the issues is just an issue of politics. The other one, though, which is sort of lived in this whole conversation, is kind of an issue of class too, right? So like all evaluations of voucher programs, right, and charter schools too, for the most part, David, I don't think I'm talking out of school, are evaluations of poor people. Rich people can make the worst decisions in the world about where to send their kids, public, private, charter, or otherwise, and nobody seems to want to study that very closely at all. So I do think there is I'm not saying we shouldn't study these things, right? I am saying that like what the hurdle for success seems to be much higher the lower income the people are, and that is just an interesting set of lenses to view this conversation through.
Yeah, that's a good way, I think, to tie those together. I want to come back to the surveys in a sec. Like the school choice, the evidence on achievement in terms of math and reading is mixed. The evidence on parent satisfaction, parents tend to be pretty satisfied. And I think what we fundamentally have here, in some ways, the values, some people are going to value that. They're going to weight that substantially more heavy. Darrell, you're probably right. There's a class overlay on that than others. And I think people also just weight how they perceive how the system should work in society. So I thought it was interesting, as Maggie said, the voucher programs are getting bigger and bigger, as that presenting that as that's a horror show. Catherine's smiling because that means the system's moving in the direction. And I mean, that's fundamentally, that's a values thing. And that's, I think one of the things that makes this conversation so tricky is that's ultimately what we're talking about. These are about the schools. I always, people are always like, we got to get the politics out of schools. And that's like,
Impossible.
that's like the whole reason we have schools. Like it's, and so you have to, and you're always going to have that. These are fundamental value political questions. Let's quickly, before I thank the panelists and thank the audience. Okay, so this is the pre-poll. So this is what everybody said. So people, people were like the both, and 11 and 13% on states and school districts for choice. What's the post poll, Sloan? Oh, we're getting kept in suspense. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to take the post poll. Audience, you can still answer the same questions. And while we're answering that, I want to thank the panelists for all your time, your thoughts, your engagement. Really appreciate all four of you for making yourselves available. And I want to thank the audience for coming. I hope people could see in the chat, there was a lot of stuff getting shared in the chat. And I guess Catherine's going to get the Omaha Steaks because people moved.
Team A jumped to Team C. It's what it looks like.
So we did have some movement. So thank you. This video will be available. You'll be able to see on the 74 on Facebook, the Reinventing America School site, and we'll make sure to link to it from Bellwether. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.